Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here today on our weekly series of the LiveVox Insider podcast. Today, we're lucky enough to have Jon Balon on the phone and via video with us. Jon, thank you very much for joining us today.
Boris, thanks for having me. Thank you.
Now, Jon, we've had a few very exciting topics to discuss and talk about today. Very specifically, we've been talking about the innovation happening within the contact center space and within the payment space. And I know those topics are very near and dear to your heart. But before we get started talking about those, Jon, if you wouldn't mind giving folks on the line with us today a little bit of your background from the financial services industry and in the tech side, just so folks can get to know you as well as I do.
So when you start thinking of career planning and all that kind of stuff, I mean, I knew day one that I wanted to be in collections and that's where I wanted to serve. And I knew that was the industry I wanted to be in. And that's exactly how the career started. I'd love to tell you that was the plan, but it wasn't. I started with a passion in mathematics and that was usually my strong suit. I loved math and I loved problem solving. So I started to go down the path of software development, and I went to Ball State University. So go Cardinals, got to give a shout out when I can. But started down the path of computer science, and I really liked the aspect of using math and using problem solving skills to take on a problem and put a cool solution together. So as I started going through school there, locally to Muncie, Indiana was Ontario Systems. Well, Ontario Systems builds the collections application that many agencies use, and they use to run their business. Not only agencies, but healthcare focused too. And so I started an internship the end of my junior year there, and started doing software engineering in this group called Link. And the neat thing about the Link group was it was working with external partners to help collection agencies and hospitals in their efforts. So the Link group was connecting these agencies with letter vendors, with skip trace vendors, with payment portal vendors, with scoring providers. I mean, a whole degree of different service offerings. So I really got into liking and seeing how that worked. And I thought it was amazing to see that we're trying to find someone. So then we reach out to these different services to try to get information to find that person. And then once we find that person, then we try to contact them via email or phone or whatever. And then once you could get them on the phone and you start to work with them, you can help them in resolving whatever situation they're in, or whatever they're trying to do to either resolve that debt or pay off that hospital bill or whatever it is. And it was really interesting, seeing that angle of it. And then I really liked seeing how the partner side worked. So after about 10 years at Ontario, I went over to RevSpring, and RevSpring does payment portals and letter processing and email communications. So it was really neat to see that side of how now working on behalf of all these different agencies, how those services helped them in getting in communication and helping people want to pay their accounts. So I was with RevSpring for about 8 years, working on a lot of different things with there, primarily in the software and the product development side. And then an opportunity arose to join the team at Williams & Fudge. And I thought that was a really interesting fit and a pretty cool career fit to go from the software application side to the vendor and data services side to now an agency side. And it's been very interesting to step back and see how awesome it is to be involved in this industry and in this space.
Yeah. It sounds like a very interesting background, just from the standpoint that you always interact with people who may have come from the operations background. It's also very interesting to get the other side of it, which is of course the software side of where you've come from. And always to get an interesting perspective on your side of how potentially problems could be solved in our industry. from the technology side. And so probably over that time, Jon, I mean, it's safe to say that you've seen quite a few things involved. But the thing that we started to talk a little bit about ahead of this podcast that I really gravitated to, and I loved your story about it, is what you guys are doing in the payment space. So I'd love to share, or I'd love you to share a little bit about what's been your take, or where you see innovation heading in the payment space, specifically for the asset management and recovery industry.
Yeah, so I think what's been really interesting is, over the years, watching through how payments are made. I mean, I remember, growing up as a kid, your parents would pay with cash only, or they'd pay with a check. And, for years, it was check or cash, and that was it. But we've evolved, as a society, on how we decide to manage our money. And most people don't even go to a bank anymore. What's been interesting is, taking a step back and saying, we need to more or less change the model and change the way that we think and put ourselves in the account holder's shoes. So really taking and stepping back and having this consumer-centric strategy and thought process to where we want to be able to accept payment methods that the consumer or the account holder that they want to use. So if someone's like, hey, I'd love to pay you today, but all I have is, let's say, PayPal, can you take that? Well, I think it's in our best interest to be able to have a platform or different ways that we could say, yes, we can do it that way because that's the way that you want it done. And it's interesting because I think of myself and I think of, like, say, someone's birthday is coming up, or this is happening, or that's happening. And I'm like, oh no, I forgot to do that. I'm jumping on Amazon, or I'm trying to find something that I could use PayPal or this because I'm too lazy to get out of bed and grab my credit card or go and grab a checkbook or whatever. But I think at the end of the day, putting ourselves from a business standpoint in the same shoes and the same light that account holder's in, if we treat each other that same way of how you would want to do something, the more flexible that we believe, the more flexible we can be with payment arrangements, payment options, payment strategies. It's just going to be in the account holder's best interest because we're there for them.
Yeah, and Jon, what you're saying makes total sense, right? Sort of gearing your strategy around the consumer to deliver services the way they expect them through other, with other providers. Now, the question that I have for you is really that seems to make sense. I mean, that's so obvious. We're talking about here, and I don't think anybody here or in the audience would disagree with you. But making the investment to move in that direction, I think, is a little bit hard to do. So the question really, I think, what comes from me and also comes from the audience, like the why. Like, is it? Do you think it's the consumer population that you're talking to today that demanded that from you, or was it, or is it something larger economically that's causing you guys to move in this particular direction? Perhaps the gig economy. I'd love your insight on that.
No, that's a great follow-up. So, I think back. So not a half hour ago, one of our neighbors they have a honey business, and they had jars of honey that they were selling.
Right.
And she sent out a message on our Facebook Messenger group and said, hey, who wants to buy this? Right. Or, who would like some? So I responded the Facebook chat or the comments and say, hey, we'd love one. And she goes, well, I could do PayPal, Venmo, a check, cash, whatever is easiest for you. And I'm like, oh, you take Venmo? Boom, done. And she just dropped it off on our porch. Easy, quick, just that was easy for me. So what we found is with examples like that, almost everybody I talk to, if let's say we go out to dinner, hey, let's split it 50-50. You have Venmo, I'll shoot you the half, you pick it up, and I'll shoot you my half over.
Right.
We're seeing more and more people use channels like that of like Venmo, Square, PayPal, etc. Because what we've kind of seen is more or less a transition of a lot of people nowadays don't just have one job, or They might have a side business or have an Etsy store. They work completely out of their home. So I think our workforce in the world today is everybody might not have the traditional, I go to a 9 to 5, 8 to 5 type job and I get paid direct deposit and I put it in here. So we believe that if, say, the person's working a part-time job and their goal is to use that money towards, say, paying off a debt that they owe, well, why don't we offer those same type of options so that once he has money in his Square account, he can make a phone call to one of our agents and say, hey, you know, I just picked up $200 from last night, you know, driving people around with my Lyft job, and I'd love to put $200 down or $200 towards my debt to try to help get this thing going. We just feel like it's a good flexible way to be, and seeing how the world's changing and utilizing all these different options. You know, I know that there's going to be investments that people will have to make, but the more creative and the more flexible you could be to the account holders, you're going to be more successful in the long run. I mean, there is the whole, you know, what's the ROI and what's this and what's that. Yeah. And the stance that I kind of look at is time is money. Yeah. In one aspect of it. And two, I want to put the ball in the consumer's court. We want the account holder to do what they want to do and be able to do that. So I could either sacrifice getting paid for 10 days, a week, or even ever, or I could offer multiple channels that allows them to pay me when they want to pay me. Yeah. Or pay us when they want to pay us.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I love how you brought up the channels piece, because, you know, some channels, of course, lend themselves to easier methods of exchanging payment, like you just talked a little bit about, John, as well. And I know you guys have been very innovative in this particular space as we've had a discussion. Specifically, the innovation that you've done in the non-voice space through a combination of, you know, social media and other messaging channels. What prompted that, if you will? So, like, what prompted that investment for your organization, or what prompted even that thought process within your organization?
So, especially with the business that we run, you know, we're trying to help students, and we're trying to help different account holders that have a debt. And the main goal that we're trying to do is we're trying to help get in touch with them, explain the balance, explain what they owe, try to do the best we can to help them in understanding what that debt is, because we've been able to communicate with them using the channels that they want to be communicated with. And then we've also provided them the payment abilities that they want to use to make a payment. So really, at the end of the day, the more we can do to help our consumers throughout the entire process, we believe is the best way to go. It's almost like, instead of being a collector, we're almost like your coach, your debt management coach or something like that.
Yeah, makes absolute sense. Also, just, you know, for what it's worth, I mean, my comment around coordinating a lot of this has had to really been thought through, not only from a technology perspective, but a strategy perspective for how you operate all of these channels. A lot of people struggle with that portion, right? The coordination of all of this kind of communication and all of the various varieties of payment types that you may be taking. How did you guys handle that challenge, or how are you handling that? Because I know that's a journey. It's not like there's some sort of you know, one-stop thing that's going to solve this.
Yeah, so it's tricky, but I think, like you mentioned a little bit earlier, there's a little bit of a common sense approach to it. Yeah. So we know that there's regulatory rules and things that we have to follow when we do work on a debt and things like that. So there's certain ways that we have to communicate, certain messages that we have to explain, and certain things that we have to say to make sure that we're following various collection laws and rules that have been set forth by you know, the FDCPA, the TCPA, when we're talking about, you know, different messaging channels, and then the CFPB and their recommendations. So what we try to do is take all of that make sure that, we're following the rules, we're making sure that we're getting the appropriate messages out to the consumer, to the account holder. But what we're also trying to do is, within that framework, not necessarily be limited to only sending, say, a physical letter, or only sending an email, or only sending a text. What we're trying to do is we're trying to show that in what we do a lot with everything is, all calls are recorded, everything, all of our consent and things like that, we capture that. So, at the end of the day, if I ask you and I say, hey, Boris, how would you like me to communicate with you? The options that I have are, I could email you, I could just call you on the phone, I could send you this information with a physical letter, I could send it through with an SMS text message to you, or, we've got some channels with, say, Twitter private messaging or Facebook messaging or different platforms. How would you like me to communicate with you going forward? And at the end of the day, some of the rules and regulations that we have to conform to have been written in the 70s. Well, the 70s didn't even know what Twitter was. Right. Like none of these messaging channels were really around. But at the end of the day, we believe that if we follow the guidelines and the purpose for that type of message, but then I put that communication ability in your hands as the account holder to tell me what your preferences are, we believe that that's the best long-term strategy. And, there's a lot of stuff you have to work with different attorneys and get different guidance on the best ways to do that. But at the end of the day, what we want to try to do is we want to try to put the communication methods, the payment methods, put those things out there in front of our account holders that they want to use. And then what we like to do is work with groups, for example, like ACA International and Inside Arm and the CFPB, and proactively share the things that we're trying and the things that we're wanting to do. Get their guidance early. Talk to attorneys early and say, you know what, we've had account holders that go to different universities. We have one university that when the student comes on campus, they strongly recommend that student use Twitter because their professors are using private messaging back and forth with the student so that they can explain assignments and explain this and explain that. So if we know that person went to that school and maybe that school then passes us that account, we might know that John Smith prefers to communicate back and forth through social media messaging. And who am I to tell him, sorry, that's not a good communication way that you should not use. You need to communicate with me this way. That's going to be a confrontational conversation right out of the gate if you approach it that way, because that's not the way he wants to communicate. So we've taken more or less that stance of, let's try to adopt channels that people actually want to use, but then navigate the financial aspect of how much that service costs, along with the regulatory rules that we need to follow, and try to do the best we can with guidance from those different regulations, guidance from attorneys, guidance from anyone that's involved, and do our part in trying to offer our account holders these options in the safest possible way, where it's safe for them, it's safe for us, and it's safe for the creditors that we represent. So that's what we try to do.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting that you're talking about some of these social media channels, specifically as you mentioned, Twitter and Facebook, and I could sort of see the link very naturally for a student that used to go to classes or still going to classes, now starting to take care of a financial obligation and that transition. I know you guys have been sort of a little bit early on. Well, you've been early on from an agency perspective, but early on in your programs with this. How are you, what will success look like?
No, it's a great question. So the tricky part is, you've got to figure out, when analyzing stuff like this,
right, and
thinking through how we want to measure success, we could simply say, look at the bottom line and say, hey, did we bring in more revenue? Right. That's great and all. But one of the things that we started doing in, our marketing team has done an excellent job in creating some different channels for these things. But we measure success multiple ways. We measure it off of, the revenue being brought in. We measure it on how much revenue and how much money we can get back to the creditors that we service, so that those colleges and universities and banks and credit unions get more money back to them that was from debt, that they can loan more. So, we look at, hey, if we can keep doing what we're doing, we're going to keep interest rates low. So, from a financial metric standpoint, that's what usually almost everyone goes to. But where I was going on the marketing side, and what we've done is we've done different things to open up and have contact forms for our consumers and account holders that they could give us feedback on how we're doing. So we use feedback from them where they'll tell us what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. And we have a whole group that takes that information in, processes it, attaches it to the account, and then we share that amongst the entire company. So we've got measurements in there for keywords of, whether someone said Venmo, whether someone said PayPal, whether someone said different things. And what we try to do is use that information that we've collected from conversations that have occurred with account holders and use that to help us know what direction we need to go. So if more, if we see an uptick in account holders saying that they want to pay through Venmo or want to pay through PayPal, or maybe they say, hey, I want to pay through Square, or I want to pay through Zelly, or who knows what the next one is tomorrow. We're using those kind of analytics to help us with our strategy and what we would do.
Yeah, I love that notion of like the customer-centric, if you will, or customer service-centric approach that you guys have really are like sort of undertaking as part of that, and in creating those feedback loops back from your own consumers, even in unfortunate situations, as you know, sometimes people can be, in order really to perfect your service. And I also love the story around innovation, right? Innovation in the space to say, hey, we're going to try this. Yeah, it may work. Maybe it doesn't work. But we're going to try and we're going to give it a go and see if there's value at the end of it. So I want to thank you very much for coming on the show with us today. I think the wealth of information you provided will be extremely valuable. So Jon, from everybody here at LiveVox, thank you very much to you and your organization, Williams & Fudge. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the time to kind of share our story. And I just encourage any business out there, think about your consumer, think about your client, think about your account holder, whatever you call them. Think about them first in your decisions and what you decide to do and what you decide to implement. And if you think of them first and you put them at the forefront of your decision making, you're going to be successful. So that's the last thing I'd like to leave everyone with.
Perfect. That's great advice, Jon. Thank you, everybody. Talk soon.